All right, it is 1 p.m. Eastern, so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for those of you that are joining us today. We have a really special program for you today. My name is Paul Moon. I'm the Senior Programs Manager at Grantmakers for Education. This is the kickoff, the first program of what we hope will be many programs in our new Native American Education Learning Series. And with that said, I would like to give a special shout out to our panelists today and our sponsor, the Bush Foundation. And I'm going to hand it over to the Education Portfolio Director at Bush Foundation, whose name is Jackie Allen. Thank you all.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to have a webinar on the introduction to Native American education. As Paul just said, my name is Jackie Statum Allen, and I am the Education Portfolio Director at the Bush Foundation. The Bush Foundation is a regional foundation. We are located in Minnesota, and we serve Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and the 23 Native nations that share that geography. I'm joining you today from my home near St. Paul, Minnesota. I have a first grader with me too. Hopefully she won't make an entrance, but if she does, I'm sure you all will understand. I'm also joined here today by two leaders and experts in education and philanthropy, Dr. Teresa Peterson and Carly Badhart-Bull. Now, I've had the privilege of working with the both of them over the past couple of years. They will introduce themselves shortly. But before so, I just wanted to tell you a bit about why this topic is so important to me. And that begins with my previous role. I used to work in strategic planning at St. Paul Public Schools here in Minnesota. And much of that strategic planning work that I did involved working on strategies to reduce the very wide gaps between student outcomes that were very racially and culturally predictable. Native American students had about a 58% four-year graduation rate, and that was 15, 20, 35 points below their peer groups, other student groups. And I learned that that wasn't an anomaly at St. Paul Public Schools, that it was happening in other places as well. And it was clear that we weren't doing all that we should in order to engage and educate Native American students in the ways that they deserved. Since being at the Bush Foundation, I've had the real honor of working alongside amazing Indigenous leaders in education. We have looked at best practices here regionally and also best practice school sites all across the country. And we've learned that when you truly honor who students are and honor the communities from which they come, then we can untap the brilliance that is already inside them. We just need to serve them better. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Carly.
Piramaya, Jackie. Hamitaku ipi. Ampetuk de iushki and wachian kapie. Washichu ia Carly Badhart-Bull and makiapie. Dakota ia tokadakia maniwi mieye. Wakpa ipaksha hamataha tka bade ota dedwatie. Minnesota makoche dedwaunye. Hello, friends and relatives. I'm happy to see you all today. In English, my name is Carly Badhart-Bull, and in Dakota, I am Tokadakia Maniwi, or woman who walks toward the future. I'm a citizen of the Flandreau Santee Sioux tribe located in South Dakota, and I live here in our Dakota homelands in Bade Ota Otue, or Minneapolis, which is in Minnesota Makoche, also known as Minnesota, right across the river from my friend Jackie. I am the executive director of an organization called the Native Ways Federation, and we were founded by 7 national Native nonprofit organizations with a mission to activate informed giving to Native nonprofits through donor education and advocacy. Now, prior to coming to Native Ways, I worked for 6 years at the Bush Foundation. I had the privilege of working with Jackie there. And my work was focused on the foundation's work across the 23 Native nations. My role at Bush actually started on the education team, and that work continued, the work in Native education in particular, continued to be a priority for me throughout my time at Bush. And that's in large part because Native education is a very personal and a professional passion of mine. Prior to Bush, I worked as an attorney in child protection, and I saw the impacts of many of the issues within our education system in that role. I also used to be a preschool and a kindergarten teacher within our education system. I taught Dakota language immersion for a few years after graduating from college, and that experience was very influential for me as an educator, as well as throughout other roles that I've played, including now as a mother. I'm thankful to Grantmakers for Education for hosting this webinar, for reaching out, for asking Native ways, for our support in helping to put it together, and to Jackie and Dr. Peterson for being here to share their wisdom and experience with us all. And with that, it's my honor to present our key speaker today, Dr. Teresa Peterson. Dr. Peterson is Sisseton Wahpeton, Dakota, and a member of the Upper Sioux community, which is one of the 11 Native nations here in Minnesota, Makoche, Minnesota. She serves as an independent consultant to tribal communities and allies from mainstream foundations and institutions with a focus on Indigenous education, planning, and evaluation. She's served her tribal community in many roles, including as an elected tribal vice chairwoman. Dr. Peterson earned her doctorate in education from the University of Minnesota Duluth and an MS in educational leadership from Southwest Minnesota State University. Her true passion is digging in her garden that overlooks the Minnesota River Valley and feeding her friends and family. Today, we're going to have a conversation with Dr. Peterson on Native education, its history and impacts, and a contemporary view of Native education as well. Now, I've known Dr. Peterson for many years, as has Jackie now, as they worked together through Bush. And so just so you know, you may hear me refer to her at times as Dr. Peterson, Teresa, or even Iche Panshi. That means female cousin in our language. As we come from different reservation communities, we are actually both Dakota, so we share the same language and culture. And while we're not blood related as far as we know, you never know, we do refer to each other in that way culturally. And I know Iche Panshi, Teresa will explain a little bit more about that, but kinship and relationship titles are very important in our culture, so that may come out. This session is going to be somewhat informal. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the session. Please post them in the chat, and we're going to do our best to get to them throughout the presentation. I'm going to be posting reflection and conversation questions throughout our time together as well. The reflection questions will encourage you to reflect on certain topics. It's up to you if you want to post responses, as we may or may not be able to get to them due to time constraints. But they're a way to get you thinking about your own experiences and help you relate to the topics in different ways. Now, with the conversation questions, we do hope you share some of your responses to add to the conversation. Now, with that, I'm going to turn things over to you, Iche Panshi, Dr. Teresa Peterson.
Umpetu washte mitaki api, chante washte na pechius api dama kota, Dakota ya utuhu chistina imaki api de Dakota chaje mitawa, pejuta zizik api hemataha, mihunka ke sampa Genevieve Walter Labat oichaki api ka, mituahe Maya Minnesota wakpa ed un hippie. Ampetuk de wachiankapi he iomakpi. So I greet you this afternoon, relatives, as relatives, and I'm Dakota. I come from the place where they dig the yellow medicine. My grandparents were Genevieve and Walter Labat. And our family makes our home on the bluff of the river valley here in Minnesota. And I'm just really happy to see all of you here today. Thank you for being here. So my interest in Native education really is been a personal pursuit, starting with when my kids were little. And I wanted to make sure that their education was relevant. And I felt like it was really important in order for them to become lifelong learners. That was really my motivation, to become a lifelong learner, for that education to really be a spark for them. And I guess moving forward, I'm hoping that we'll together, all of us, provide more opportunities for our Native children to have relevant and education that provides inspiration for them. And so I hope that for my future grandchildren. Next slide, Paul. So today, I just want to point out that we're really just providing an overview. This is going to be just touching on some Some areas real briefly. It's really intended as an introduction. As Paul shared, it's really to support further learning in some, you're gonna have an opportunity to attend more sessions. So this is a foundation for that. Also, I understand that in the future, you'll have some potential site visits out to Indian country. So it's really to provide a preparation for that, some context and some history and some terminology as well. And I think this is really important as a former director for Dakota Wichocha, which is a Native nonprofit here in Minnesota. We have lots of funders come out and visit. And during those visits, I was always surprised by the type of questions that were asked. Because I thought like some of that information would be like people would know that information. And so it really became apparent to me that while organizations like ours worked really hard to understand the world of philanthropy, that often wasn't reciprocated. And so I just want to commend all of you for being here today, for preparing and learning more for your future site visits. Again, this is just really a brief overview. I would probably take a semester to teach something like this or share this. And so we're going to try to do something in 90 minutes. So it'll be, again, just an overview. We're going to touch real briefly on traditional education. And what we mean by that isn't probably what people typically think of classrooms and desks, but really pre-colonial education in our communities. And then we'll talk a little bit about that colonial education and the impacts of that. And then before we move into like this era of reclamation, reclaiming our Indigenous education. At the end, we'll be able to provide some additional resources for you to follow up. So as we move into this first section, I'd really like for folks to really think about what is the purpose of education? Next slide. So from our community, from Dakota community, and I would say Indigenous community as well, really the purpose is to be a good relative. I want to share just a quote from one of my favorite scholars, Dakota scholars, Ella Deloria, who shared, "The ultimate aim of Dakota life, stripped of accessories, was quite simple. One must obey kinship rules. One must be a good relative." So we have this saying, "Mitakuye Owasi," and it translates to all my relations, all my relatives. And we use it in our greeting, we use it at the end of our prayers. And if you will, it's really our worldview. We understand that all things are related, all people are related. And it's that relationality that really shapes all that we do. So for example, when I introduced myself just a moment ago, I said, "Dakota ya utuhu chistina e makiapie." And that means they call me Little Oak Woman. And so you'll notice a difference that from our mainstream introductions are often I am. And so it's really a decentering of kind of that individualistic perspective. It really promotes this idea of belongingness, that I belong to somebody. Again, Mitakuye Owasi, a connectedness with self, with family, with our extended family, with community, land, and all things. All things are in relationship and all things matter. So I would just wanted to ask both Carly and Jackie to think about an educational experience where being a good relative was taught or learned or lifted up. So I'll just let you share that.
Sure. When you first asked this question, the first thing I thought about was when I used to teach in a Dakota language immersion program. So I taught preschool and then kindergarten. And in that classroom, instead of saying Ms. or teacher, the students called me and the other teacher, they called us Tui. So I was Tui Carly, she was Tui Beth. Tui means auntie. So again, these weren't necessarily blood relations, but similar to what has already been shared, kinship and the recognition of being in a relationship is really important in our culture. We also had elder first language speakers in the classroom to help us as we were still students in the language ourselves, and they were referred to as kunshi and unkana, or grandmother and grandfather. And that's something you'll see when you go into our communities often, and it's more and more actually as our people are returning to some of these traditional ways. Is, if I'm talking to an elder or somebody of a certain age, I might call them auntie, I might call them tui, I might call them kunshi. And that's just it's a sign of respect and a sign of recognizing that we're in relationship with one another. I also, when I was in, another quick example, when I was in college, I had my first Native professor who helped me navigate independent study courses. And I thought about this because, this was where I was able to get credit for the work I was doing volunteering in my community. Having that kind of service-oriented experience recognized by academia was really important to me because it helped me to have a good college experience as I felt more connected to the work. It allowed me to see myself and my college experience, my academic experience as connected to my role in community, rather than compartmentalizing things in a way that would have made me feel more disconnected. Jackie, do you want to share?
Yeah, thanks for that, Carly. I think for me, when I think about being a relative and education experiences, I kind of have to compare two very different experiences that I had. So from kindergarten through 8th grade, I went to a parochial school. It was very small. It was just about all white. My twin brother and I were usually the only two, maybe sometimes three, Black children that were in the classroom. And we experienced a whole lot of racism, very covert and also a lot of overt from school staff and from the parents of our friends. But then once I moved into a public high school and suddenly I was in community with many more Black students, even though we were still a minority, but there were more of us. I understood what it meant to be in that kind of community, that kinship, and how we all encouraged one another, stood up for one another, supported one another, and really did our best because we felt that we were not only a reflection on ourselves and our family, but also the pride of the entire group. And I think that type of kinship and network that really has driven what I've done and in education experiences in high school and college and grad school, always looking for that community to be a part of and to hold up and be proud of.
Thank you. Those are really great examples. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the teaching and learning that happens through this traditional education model. So again, relationships are paramount. And I want to just point out a couple of concepts and words here. Wakayaja means sacred being or a sacred child. And so it's a child beloved that's nurtured and provided a sense of belonging really through these relationships. So learning your kinship terms and coming to understand that everybody is related to you. You make everybody a relative, and so everyone belonged. Everyone is a relative. So in addition to that, if you look at the social structure of our Dakota communities, really is a circle around that beloved child is our Tiwahe, the people that live together, and then our Tioshpaye, the extended families, all of our uncles and aunties and grandmas and grandpas, and then the Oyate, the nation, the people, the whole community. So that is really our social structure that really provides that sense of belonging and nurturing that we know is really correlated to education. And then the other term that I wanted to share was this around how we do things informally. So how do we transfer knowledge in that informal way through family and community? So these two terms I have provided here, wowachie really, if you looked it up in the dictionary, it would say accountable and responsible, but it means so much more than that. It really is arrives from that place of that Creator gave each of us talents and gifts and strengths to share with the people. And so as a young person is growing up, those are nurtured, and in turn, then that becomes a way to give back, that generosity, that wacha tohanaka, that ability to live out your purpose within your community and your family. So all of these duties, obligations, privileges, and honorings were really wrapped up in that idea of reciprocity, the reciprocal relationships. And this is what made up our Dakota Oyate. I'm gonna share a video clip, so I'm gonna ask Paul to just to ring home again this idea around relationships and how that really contributes to traditional education and still is here today. And we hope that these videos will come across really clear for you.
Materialism was not a big thing. I mean, we owned stuff. Sure, we did. We owned the women owned their teepees, and we all owned our clothing and stuff. We had to acquire stuff in order just to get by every day. But it wasn't for the sake of stockpiling it so we could have more than everybody else. Because that's not what our economy was based on. If we had an economy at all, it was a trading economy. We traded within our communities and with other tribes. But it was not a capitalistic economy. It was not by any means. And you know, it all goes back to the circle. Is the ultimate symbol of kinship, as we were taught. Everybody, everything and everyone that's alive belongs in that circle. It's very simple. It doesn't matter whether you're an ant or a buffalo, or people, or a bird, or anything else. Any of the variety of life that we have here in this part of the country, that our ancestors were part of. Everything belonged in that circle. And so we're all related in that sense. That's a larger kinship. And that's why we say Mitaku Yoyase, because we invoke that connection to everything that is. And no one has a higher or lower place in that circle. No one is first and no one is last. And it's the same way within our own familial kinship system. I mean, we all know it. I mean, those of us who are aware of our culture know it, that they know it. The brothers of your father are also, you address as ate, and the only uncle you have is your mother's brothers. That's your uncle. And your mother's sisters, if she has any, you also address as Ina. And the only auntie you have are your father's sisters. So, you know, what that does is it brings everybody closer in concept. Because look at all the mothers you have. Look at all the dads you have. By the same way, look at all the grandmas and grandpas you have out there. When I was a kid, and all these old people would come visit us, my grandma and grandpa always said, there's your grandpa, there's your grandma. So I always addressed them as such. Whether they really were by blood or not didn't matter, because what that did is we created that relationship. I have a grandmother to grandson relationship with that person. I have a grandfather to grandson relationship, and there were numerous kinds of those relationships. And what it did is enabled that sense of who I was. It affirmed it. It made me feel good about myself to have all these people there when I needed them, if I needed them. I remember a few years ago, somebody was talking about the fact that somebody wrote a book or somebody came up with the concept that the village raises, you know, child. No big deal. We've been doing that for a long time. It's not new to us, but we just need to do more of it. We need to, you know, again, make it an important part of the process. Materialism was not a big thing. I mean, we owned stuff. Sure, we did. We had to.
Oh, technology. I hope that you were able to hear that. Sometimes we know technology can be a little dicey on Zoom, but I really appreciate the words of Joseph Marshall III. I love hearing our elders' voices. He's a Lakota historian and teacher, and he was the founder of Sinte Galeska Tribal College out in Rosebud. So I hope that helped kind of ring home those concepts around that sense of belonging that's really supported through kinship. And then to make that connection to if we have these relatives, how are we in relationship to each other? How do we behave? How are we responsible? How do we respect in our relationships and that giving back? We're going to provide a resource at the end by Martin Brokenleg. And if you wanted to learn a little bit more about this, how traditional education and the raising of children was really supported through this model. He's a Lakota scholar and teacher as well, Martin Brokenleg. And he really speaks about this idea of belonging, mastery, interdependence, and generosity. So if you want to learn more about that. So I'm going to have Paul bring up our slide, and we're going to talk a little bit about how formal teaching occurred. So that was the informal, and kind of this formal aspect of traditional education was really done through ceremony and storytelling. And just briefly, we have all kinds of ceremony. We still practice them today, but coming of age and naming ceremonies, ceremonies that help kind of purify, making of relatives. But all of these are intended to honor, recognize, celebrate, pray, and heal with our relatives. So it's a coming together. It's a continuing coming together of relatives. And the other way is through storytelling, which is one of my favorite areas. It's this area that I studied about the impact and importance of storytelling and how it shapes our identity. In our Dakota and Lakota ways, we have two types of stories. Wicho Oyake, which are mainly more about the history, the genealogy, those type of stories. And then our Hitunkakapi stories, those are our tales and legends. But all of these stories were traditionally passed on from generation to generation to generation and really promoted through oral history. We did not, back in the day, didn't document those, but we do today, some of those. But the storytelling really helps promote and provide that sense of belonging and shaping identities and enriching our minds and developing critical thinking skills. And we're going to hear just a short clip from a storyteller. And I'm going to ask Carly to introduce our storyteller because it's one of her relatives.
So you're going to watch a video with a story being told by one of my relatives, Grandpa Sidney Bird. Hopefully it works. If it's a little choppy, close your eyes. The words are so important, but hopefully it isn't. So he's actually filmed in this video at the senior living community in my home community in Flandreau, in South Dakota. And that's where he lived for many years before passing away just a few years ago at the age of 97. Now, Grandpa Sid was a very well-known storyteller from our community in Flandreau, though he also spent much of his youth on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. He had a gift with words, as you will witness, and with song. He knew and shared many stories, and those ranged from legends and trickster tales to personal historical accounts. He lived through a lot, and he had a lot to share. He was a fluent language speaker, and he was also a minister. He actually conducted the wedding ceremony for my husband and I, which I'll always be grateful for. He's very much missed, but we are grateful that we have a number of his recordings of his stories and his songs, such as this one, that are helping us to continue on with learning and teaching the lessons that he was able to share with us. So I hope you enjoy this video.
Rabbit at one time had short ears and a long tail. And the badger was a fearless warrior lived in a tough environment. And that rabbit wanted to be a warrior, just like the badger. Badger had battle marks, paint, face. You look at a badger, you want. So how do you? Well, you have to live in them. You have to be impervious to pain. You can't let that bother you. You have to be able to withstand pain. So he decided, well, I'll be a badger warrior. First thing he got into his tail got caught. He pulled, but pop. So his tail got short. And then he got in. His ears got caught. And he started pulling them. His ears pulled long and he's got a short tail. They can have it, they can be there. I don't want to be a warrior. So they sing this song. Mashti chala na wizina, tite ona kishto shoka. Mashti chala na wizina, tite ona kishto shoka. The rabbit got jealous and lost his tail. Hi ho, hi ho, hi ho, hi ho. The rabbit got jealous and lost his tail. Hi ho, hi ho, hi ho, hi ho.
I hope that came through for all of you. What a delight he is, or was. What a treasure. And I'm so glad that they were able to record him. We're going to hear him a little bit more throughout our time together. And I believe they're going to post the links in the chat as well for you to access, just in case they were a little choppy. But I just want to say that our traditional education, I mean, even though we talk about that in kind of like pre-colonial times, I want you to know that a lot of those traditions, the way that we transfer of knowledge, teaching and learning, through storytelling, through ceremony, all of those things continue today. But unfortunately, much of that was really disrupted through colonialism and through a number of things here. The war and removal and treaties and allotments and forced Christianization and things like that. And all of those things are really, as we look at those, are really about genocide. And so I did want to read the definition of genocide through the United Nations. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. Killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And so all of those things occurred within Indigenous communities throughout Turtle Island here, throughout the United States. So I'm providing this definition because, again, all these things happen, but through a real deliberate and systematic, the government policies and practices. And really all of these things were really intended to eradicate the people, dismantle the power of tribal nations, and really break down the Oyate. So when we think about those circles that surrounded our Wakayaja, our sacred child, the Tiwahe, Tioshpae, Oyate, you can see this diminishment through these policies. And war removal treaties really started with the breakup of the Oyate and then into land allotments around the Tioshpae and so on. So I do want to show just a little clip again, Paul, that shows kind of this first, and again, we're providing some context because all of these policies really are connected, and you'll see how this was very intentional of dismantling the structure, and then how it eventually the federal government took over educating Native people. So we're giving a little bit of historic context here, and it is really important. So I am going to go into screen share again. And maybe some of you have seen this clip. It's very powerful. So you can tell from the dates that, you know, there were still wars and forced removal happening into the 1800s, but there was this shift then that really was about assimilation, an era of assimilation, and there were a number of policies that we're going to go through that was very intentional about assimilating Native people into, and basically into white Christian way of life. So one of them was the breakup of land into allotments and forcing, you know, trying to force people into being farmers, and then the forced Christianity. Blood quantums, and again, I'm just like really glossing over a lot of this, and you're going to have to do more, you know, research on your own on this and reading on your own. But blood quantums were also introduced during this time, and it was really a tool to kind of eliminate the status as an Indian and eliminate, if we try to push people as non-Indian anymore, then the federal government feels like they don't have a responsibility for their treaty and trust responsibilities to tribes. So I want to just ask if Carly has anything you want to share about that. Anything you want to add before I shift into boarding schools?
Well, I know we're covering a lot of information today, and so there's no way that we can cover all of this, you know, the history and the context. But I will share that, you know, one of the things that I learned through my work in education, through my work in the law, and then through my work in philanthropy is just the lack of information, the lack of information that people know, I should say. The information is out there, but so many people just don't know a lot about us, and that's across the board. And unfortunately, you know, this was intentional. So we are a people that in many respects were supposed to disappear. That was the intention of the policies that we're going to be talking about, whether they were, intended to make us disappear physically, culturally, spiritually. That was the intent. And so the fact that there's so much that people don't know about us, it's related to that. And yet, when you start to learn this information, when you know that there are people out here, such as some of us who are speaking today, and I'm sure many folks who are also listening in the chat, and other folks in your own communities, we have 574 recognized tribal nations in this country. We're sharing some of the language from Dakota community, but there are so many more languages and ways of doing things. And it's important to recognize that. It's important to know that. There was a study done by the Kellogg Foundation not too long ago, and First Nations Development Institute and Echo Hawk Consulting put it together. But a national survey about people's perceptions of Native people found that 40% of those who were surveyed didn't know that we still exist. And then there have been other studies that have shown that 89% of history standards across the country don't mention Native people pre-1900. Pre-1900. So we once existed, European settlers came, and then we were gone. But the fact is that's not our story, and people need to know that. They need to know that we exist today, as well as the current context. And that's why I'm so grateful that we're having this conversation today.
Maya, Carly, for that. And some of the, again, there's going to be a list of resources, again, because we're kind of going over this really quickly, and there's a lot more. It's a complicated history to tell, and it's challenging to do in a short period of time. And so even the study that Carly mentions, we do have that link in our additional resources that we'll share at the end. But I want to circle back to this last bullet, Indian boarding schools, and to the definition that the UN provided on forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And so Indian boarding schools in particular were really devastating. This assimilation policy, this government policy, was really intended to break up the families and that tight kinship circle that Joseph Marshall shared and spoke of so well. So it was very detrimental to our people. Next slide. So again, this is the transition. Indian boarding schools were really the transition where the federal government took control of educating our children. And so this happened during 1860 to 1960, which is not that long ago. So over that 100-year period, hundreds of thousands of children were in boarding schools and away from their homes and their families and communities. The Indian boarding schools were government funded, and they were also church run. And so oftentimes the government would assign a particular denomination to run a school, whether that's Presbyterian, Catholic, Lutheran, like that. And this picture here is of the first off-reservation Indian school, Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. So the boarding school era stripped away the culture, the language, the ways of being. I mean, you could just see it through this picture, right? Knowing, understanding, all of that we spoke of in traditional education was absent.
Teresa, there's a question in the chat about what is meant by blood quantum, and it's a really good question. It's a complicated question,
Yes.
And it's a difficult question. And so I'll share a little bit, and then if you want to add to it, please do. So blood quantum is a way of measuring how much Indian blood, how much Native blood one has. Now, again, there are 574 tribes across the United States, and as sovereign entities, they each have the power to determine what their own requirements are for citizenship in a nation, because we are citizens of nations. That being said, this concept of blood quantum didn't come from us. We didn't have that concept before colonization. It's something that was imposed upon us. This concept of this idea of having to prove how much Indian you were. And in the past, you received benefits by proving, if you could prove that you had less Indian blood, right? And that has changed over the years depending on context. But there's a lot of history here. There's a lot of complications when you talk about, you know, how that was proven, the measurements for determining that. For example, in my own family, my grandfather, his parents passed away when he was little. He didn't have a birth certificate. We didn't know his birthday. We can't count, even though he was a fluent speaker and came from his home reservation, we can't count his blood quantum for purposes of determining citizenship. We have to count others. So that's, again, it's a complicated question, but it's a measurement that is still used today. But again, I also think it's really important to recognize that it's a measurement system that did not come from us. It's something that was imposed upon us by the United States government, and that has continued. And yet, at the same time, there are many nations who are working on, at least there are some nations who are working on different definitions of citizenship. And again, that's a whole other conversation. And if you're interested in learning more, please feel free to reach out and we can share some resources. Teresa, anything you want to add?
I just think maybe that just adding the point that, so part of the rules were that you can't be enrolled in more than one tribe. And you can't marry your own relatives because that's one of our social taboos. Well, so then pretty soon you don't have enough blood quantum to their definition. And yeah, it's so complicated. But so the whole point was to really eventually say, there's no more Indians left. We don't have to, we don't have any federal trust responsibilities for them anymore, for all the land treaties that were done, which we'll talk a little bit more about that federal trust responsibility and how it pertains to education coming up. If you want to read a little bit more, and yes, we'll provide resources, but David Bolio, an Anishinaabe scholar, wrote about the impact of blood quantum and how it was used to take more land away. And he's from the White Earth Reservation, so you could Google him. Okay, so I want to move us into a little bit deeper into our boarding school piece, and we're going to listen to our relative Sid Bird here again and his experience in boarding school, and this is about his arrival there. So I'm going to share my screen.
Indian boys waiting. That's the first Indians I saw. Oh, we talk about it. I got so glad I began. They both burst out laughing. They were Indians, but different tribes, so they couldn't understand what I was saying. But each time I walked, they would start laughing. I couldn't imagine. One of them had me sit down. I was wearing my shoes, but they were wrong foot on the wrong shoe, and I was walking like a duck. So brought me to we call it the disciplinarian's office. That's what the word, disciplinarians. I think now they call it advisors or counselors, but no, they were called disciplinarians. My uncle had taught me what to say. You know, him stood there. He said, "What is your name?" Sid Bird, sir. Where are you from? Porcupine, South Dakota, sir. How old are you? First grade, sir. How old are you? First. Then I remembered, 6 years old, sir. What grade will you be in? First grade, sir. Another boy apparently did the same thing. He said, "Where are you from?" Joe, where do you go? What is your name? Winnebago, Nebraska. We learned by rote and we had to respond to them. They marched us, they made us take off, they zipped off all of our hair, removed all of our clothing, marched us in our nakedness into some jail cells. These were metal stalls. I thought, now I'm going to be sentenced to death for the rest of my life. Steel stone, standing in our nakedness. And then we were made to turn some knobs. Water came out of the wall. I bathed in a creek in that home. Wintertime, I bathed in a number 12 wash tub. So this was utterly, you could regulate the force of the water, the temperature of the water by regulating. Then they made redskins out of us. Took a long handled brush, soaped us down and scrubbed us. Our skin turned red, scrubbing it. Made the rinse off, then turn the knobs. And then they gave us towels. And they dried themselves off. We were given army uniforms. 6 years old. Army uniforms. Looked like soldiers, little boys.
A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. That quote is from General Richard Henry Pratt. He was an Army general. And in that last slide, we saw the picture of the children in front of the Carlisle School. And that is the school that he led. And so this kill the Indian, save the man really became the sentiment and philosophy of educating Native children throughout all these boarding schools. Just want you to take a moment to look at these two pictures. They're actually the same children. They are Apaches at Carlisle in 1886. These children were taken from their families, homes, and communities, stripped of their belongingness and purpose that we spoke of earlier. You heard Sid share about how their hair was cut. And I just want to point out that a lot of, Native cultures, long hair, cutting the hair is like a sign of being in mourning. So you can imagine the impact of and confusion for these children. You heard Sid talk about the military style of education. Everybody wore those uniforms. It was very regimented. Typically, they were half day of labor. English only. And people were punished for speaking the only language they knew. Certainly, this was, the school was a method for forced Christianity. And I'll point out that there was a lot of physical and sexual abuse that occurred at these schools. The goal was to assimilate, to kill the Indian and save the man. So the impacts resulted in trauma, and I'm going to read this definition by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services of historical trauma. It is a multi-generational trauma experienced by a specific cultural, racial, or ethnic group. It is related to major events that oppressed a particular group of people because of their status as oppressed, such as slavery, the Holocaust, forced migration, and the violent colonization of Native Americans. So we know this historical trauma, I mean, just boarding school alone occurred over a 100-year period, but these traumas then become generational trauma. And we want to point out too that 1960 was not that long ago. There are people today, still alive today, that attended boarding school. You know, it affects physical, mental, emotional, spiritual health of people. It was a detrimental to language loss. One of the resources we're going to share with you is the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition website, and I hope that you guys please check that out. But they really, it's an effort to educate and to promote healing within the family, within our communities and nations. I want to share one more clip of Sid returning home, and then we're going to have a little conversation about our experiences of the impact of boarding schools.
And Ichipanshi, Teresa, while you tee that up, there was a question in the chat about how many boarding schools exist today. And I don't know the answer. I don't know if you do. I believe there are a few off-reservation boarding schools. And then I know in my home community of Flandreau, there is still a boarding school, but they're different than their predecessors. I know in Flandreau, while they still have a lot of challenges, the tribe is much more involved with running that school now. Do you have any additional information to share about the current status of boarding schools?
I was going to mention the Flandreau Indian School as well, but yes, those are different today. And if they're native schools, they're often run by tribal communities or tribal people, and vastly different from the boarding school during that era. I think you probably shared on chat the numerous, and the number keeps adding. So if you go to that National Boarding School Healing Coalition website, they have a map that shows all the boarding schools that they know of across the United States. And when I look at even Minnesota, I can see like they're still missing at least one that I know of. And so they keep adding, and they're doing a lot of research about these boarding schools. So yeah, really significant. Okay, let's listen to Sid here.
After 3 long, lonely years, the disciplinarian called me in the office, a dreaded office. Going to the disciplinarian's office was never a happy experience. It only meant one thing, meant punishment. He was a disciplinarian. Called me in. He said, "Sid, how would you like to go home?" It never occurred to me. Yes, sir. Go take a shower, change in your uniform, bring whatever you want to bring, take home with you. So I took my shower, changed into my army uniform, came in a little bag, a few things that I wanted to take home with me. He took me down to the railroad station, bought me a train ticket, gave me some money to buy my lunch, and I left. Long trip home. Arrived at Gordon, Nebraska. I looked out the window and I saw my grandparents. I practically leaped from the train and I ran, I grabbed my grandmother. Tears were down my cheeks, tears were down. And that is the happiest day of my life, just to be with my grandmother. And my grandfather said, "Hakosha, you made some improvements in your life. You look like you're going to go to war." He said, "Yeah, army uniform." Yeah. And that was the beginning however harsh it was, we were beaten for speaking our own language at the school. So I had a hard time, but at home, no one spoke English, so I was able to relearn my language. He said, oh, the old man tells you the heart and soul of any culture is the language. Once the language is gone, you're no longer a people. After
Well, I'll jump in here actually with the question for you, Dr. Peterson and Carly. I understand that both of you had relatives who attended boarding schools. Are you able to share how that has impacted you and how you bring that into the work that you do today?
Yeah, and I can start. I know Teresa's teeing some stuff up here. You know, in my family, my grandparents met at boarding school. They actually met at the Flandre Indian School. As I mentioned, my grandfather, his parents passed away when he was little, and he and his siblings were all separated and sent to different schools across the country. He actually grew up primarily at Tucson and Rapid City. And I grew up hearing stories about him that he shared, you know, stories about being a little boy hopping trains, trying to run away, trying to get back home to Yankton, which is where he was from. And he would laugh about these stories when he was telling them. And it wasn't until years later when I, you know, understood more about the history that I learned that the kids who tried to run away were actually, you know, they were punished. And of course, he never talked about that, right? And, you know, my mother-in-law, she's in her early 70s and she grew up at boarding school, and she's, you know, shared a lot of stories about what that's like, what it's like to grow up and not have family around you, and how that impacted her experience when she became a mother, when she was raising her own children, some of the struggles she went through. You know, she practices traditional medicine now, but a lot of the stuff she knows about our culture, she had to learn as an adult. And so these are stories that we share regularly. You know, this isn't ancient history. This is the current context in many of our communities. And as a result of this era, there's an incredible distrust of educational systems and institutions in our communities. And so a lot of the work that I've done in multiple sectors has been around, you know, encouraging or, you know, trying to encourage support of Indigenous voice, Indigenous story, and access to cultural identity, because that's something that is so very important to our people.
I guess I'll just briefly share, you know, both my grandparents went to boarding school. My grandma went to Pipestone with her sisters, and my grandpa went to Flandre Indian School early on. And, you know, they both had stories that they shared with me, but not a lot. And I think, you know, it might have been probably a little bit painful for them. But my grandma did share with me that she said, oh, I was so little. She said, I think I was only 5 or 6. I was so young. I had to sleep with the matrons. She had to stay with the matrons. She was so young. My grandma, you know, her mother had passed away when she was 2. So, you know, so I just think about things like that's who, you know, that was her mother. That was her mother's, those boarding school matrons. And then my grandpa in our family, I know he has shared that, yeah, it was like a half day of labor. And at Flandre, what they did a lot of is they sewed, they made uniforms and things like that. And so I know there's some, you know, we try to make humor out of just about everything, but our family, like my mom would laugh about how, like, he could sew really fast. He was an excellent sewer. But, you know, I've done a lot of research with this and have their boarding school documents and letters that where her dad was writing to get permission for them to come home. And it's hard to read those. But the more I dig in and learn about, these, how our family has been shaped by a lot of these government policies, things start to make a lot of sense. So I'll just say that much. So, basically, to kind of wrap up this boarding school era, it was really detrimental. But one thing that came out of it was a report, and it's called the Miriam Report. So a group of experts surveyed the landscape of Indian reservations across 26 states, and it was led by Louis Miriam. He was working with the Institute for Government Research, and it was actually financed by the Rockefeller Foundation. This report revealed extreme poverty, poor health, sanitation, poor housing conditions, and basically they came out and said, assimilation doesn't work. This is not working. So they came out with a bunch of recommendations. They stopped building new off-site federal boarding schools. There was a push to more day schools on reservations. Not sending people like my grandma's age anymore to schools. That was too young. Promoted more vocations. They had this outing system where they would allow local farmers or families take kids in, and they would work for them for free. So they got rid of some of those kind of crazy practices within this boarding school era. So, and you can read more about those. But really what the Miriam Report set up was that, again, this acknowledgement that the boarding school system doesn't work. And it helped shift the government policy, like from this real push for assimilation to more self-determination. And so I have this piece here, 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, because it was real pivotal for tribal communities. It set up where tribes could start making their own decisions about their own people. It was passed by Roosevelt. You can read about it some more, but basically it ended allotment, which, was the complete deterioration of community lands and basically a policy for continued land theft. So it ended that. It acknowledged this, the devastation of boarding schools. And it was a place where then these federal boarding schools, these federal government run schools, which then kind of fell under the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which we call BIA schools today. It allowed for them to include Indian history and culture into those schools to be taught. One of the downsides to the IRA, to the Indian Reorganization Act, was that, and it was intended to address kind of poverty. So they would provide opportunity for tribes to access loan dollars to help develop an economy for tribal communities. But the caveat was then that you had to accept this IRA form of government, which was really a cookie cutter government structure that did not match the way that tribes govern themselves. So the values did not align. I could go on and on about that probably for a day and continue on. But what I want to point out in this policy shift was we had this kind of reorganizing where acknowledgement that, hey, we're probably screwing things up here. And then there was, as in shifts of administration that we experience even today, there was a shift of how to handle Indians. So there was this push for termination again. So like, if we terminate tribes, then we no longer have any federal trust responsibility. And so there was this law that came in 1957 that terminated over 100 tribes. And some of those tribes, even today, are still trying to regain their recognition. We could talk probably all day about that. Let's see, Carly, do you want to share anything before we jump to the next series of policies?
Yeah, I think just sharing that, that we're sharing a lot of language, federal trust responsibility, tribal sovereignty. What does all of this mean? All of this is very much connected to Native education. It's very much connected to everything we're talking about today. And it's very much connected to all aspects of our communities. And we also recognize we don't have a lot of time to get into it. So just, real briefly, I think it is important to recognize that, we mentioned there's 574 nations. Currently, there are many more that have tried to get through the process or continue to. But these are federally recognized tribes, which means they've been recognized by the federal government that they have the inherent ability to self-govern as sovereign nations. Sovereignty was not given to tribes. It existed before Europeans arrived and was recognized in multiple ways, including through treaty making. And so again, another topic that we could dig into much deeper. And if folks are interested, please let us know because we have the resources, we have the information, we have the people to talk more about that. But it's just important to know that these are important things to be talking about. Treaties are what resulted in this legal concept known as the federal trust responsibility. In exchange for land, Native people were promised certain things, which unfortunately the federal government has not made good on that promise. And that included amongst, retaining hunting and fishing rights, guarantees of peace, money, food. It also included support for the education of our nation's children. And so that's something that's really, again, important to recognize that when we're talking about our relationship with government, that there are obligations there as a result of colonization, as a result of the taking of our land. And unfortunately, those obligations have not been met over time and continue to be under-resourced.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Carly. Yeah, so to kind of build off of that idea of, the neglect of federal trust responsibility, there became this era of civil rights and the American Indian movement and lots of other factors that really pushed for the self-determination of tribes. And again, while we're not going to go through each one of these policies and there's more than this, but they were just provided as really pivotal policies that came into play that affected tribal communities and of course our own children. And so I just want to point out just a couple here. In 1969, so you remember there was the 1928 Miriam Report that said basically hey, assimilation isn't working. This 1969 report had very similar themes and concerns that came out along with some recommendations. And they really called for the correction of this historic paternalism that was prevalent not only in education, but across, all of health and welfare of Indian people. So, and it also really affirmed what Ichepashi was talking about, this tribal sovereignty, that this is inherent tribal sovereignty, and tribes have the right to determine their own future. So this 1969 report is really interesting to read, again, tying it to the shift in how education was handled. So basically there was a shift from federal boarding schools into day schools on reservations that I mentioned just so briefly before, and then a shift into state schools and giving states contracts, and this happened during the 50s, contracts, or in the 30s, contracts for states to start assuming some responsibility for tribes and tribal people. Although what happens then is there's this deterioration of, again, federal trust responsibility.
Ichepashi, there was a question about whether the slides might be made available after the presentation.
I believe so. I think Paul can address that at the end, but I'm quite sure that they can make them available. Yes.
I'll also take this chance to break in with another question. So we've covered a lot so very quickly. Thank you, Dr. Peterson. This is not easy, I'm sure, to cover so much history in 90 minutes, but thank you. So you've talked quite a bit about these policies. What sort of impact have they had on you and your families? I would love for you to just reflect on that and share a bit.
Sure. Well, so for me, I'm a little bit older than my Chepashi. And so my mom, you know, again, when I did all the history of everything, I mean, I think about my great-great-grandma who survived war and exile and fled to Canada. And then I think about my great-grandma who was part of like reservation land allotment eras that we went through. And then I think about my grandma who was in Indian boarding school and, you know, raised through that. And then I think about my mom, and we come up to the 1950s where she was part of that Indian Relocation Act. And again, it was kind of good intentioned, you know, it was intended to address poverty on reservation, but it moved people, they relocated Indians to urban centers. And so my mom, you know, went to Minneapolis, and it was intended to teach, you know, to educate through trades. And so she learned, went to beauty school, learned to be a beautician. And so I really, you know, am, you know, a product of that Indian relocation, that assimilation era, and was born into this era of civil rights. And so all of these things that happened in the 70s, I benefited from them. You know, I got to spend a lot of time during my life, my adult life, working on language revitalization, which then of course impacted my children positively. I'll turn over to Carly to share a little bit about her experience.
Sure. So yeah, my grandfather was a fluent speaker of our language, but he didn't pass it down. You know, my grandmother, she said she knew and understood the language, but she refused to speak it. So it's really complicated, but I now understand that they did this out of love. You know, they did this out of their lived experience, where they, you know, were punished for speaking the language. But as a result, my father didn't learn our language. However, his career, his academic and professional experiences led him into his involvement with the American Indian Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. So his generation was all about reasserting our rights, not just to exist, but to live and thrive as Native people. And so I both have the, you know, that historical, some of the negative context, as well as some of the positive things that some of my people have, you know, our people have done to help us move forward. And today, you know, many folks in our current generation are taking those learnings into the work that we do. We see a lot of work on language reclamation, you know, making sure that there is access to cultural identity, because our generation recognizes and has experienced firsthand the repercussions of language and cultural loss. And so, you know, there's a lot of work to be done, with our elders, you know, across generations, in order to make sure that our future generations don't have to struggle in the same ways that we have.
Next slide. So I never want to leave us just in history, right? Because we're still here. And so let's bring it forward to contemporary. And I know we don't have much time left, but I wanted to at least have a time to introduce this era of reclamation. And so again, we look at the federal government, the state government between those two reports, and we recognize like they're almost like very similar reports. And so we have to start recognizing that it's not a Native student's problem, it really is the systems. And the difference is that Native education has not been in the control of Native people for a long time. And so again, Native students are not the problem. We're in this era of defining and controlling our own education of our own students. A couple of things that just came out of this newer era is that today there's a law that requires any school with 10 or more Native students that they have to have an Indian Parent Advisory Council, and their work is to really guide and advise the education of Native students in that school district. More recently, there's requirement, and this should have happened, you know, ages ago, but to really conduct authentic consultation with tribes on the education of their own students. There's this Esther Martinez Language Preservation Act, which really helped move from having a language like 1 hour of language a week or a day to this understanding that really to revitalize and reclaim Native languages, which we heard throughout, they're central to Native ways of being. But it really requires an immersion approach, and so it allows for that immersion programming. I just want to ask Carly if there's anything you want to share before we move into models, and ask Jackie to share a bit about some of the promising models that are occurring.
I know we're short on time, so I'm happy to just move things on. Jackie, if you could share.
Okay, sure. Well, I would like to just share some regional to us and also national exemplars of Indigenous education and organizations that are doing some really great work that I hope you all will learn about. There's the NIEA, that's the National Indigenous Education Association. That's been around since 1969. They work on strategy issues and policy issues. At the Bush Foundation, we've been able to sponsor some of their events. There's also COSA, that's the Commission on Ashanti Sakoin Accreditation. So that is about giving accreditation to tribal schools in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And the Bush Foundation is really proud to be supporting that work as well. And I think everyone should know about NACA, that's the Native American Community Academy. It's a school in Albuquerque, New Mexico that was established in 2006. And there they have a focus around cultural and language and holistic wellness, teaching that whole child. We've had the ability, the privilege of visiting there several times, and also working with their organization, NACA Inspired Schools Network. That's where they work with building the capacity of individuals, they call them fellows, over a couple of years in order to turn around schools that are serving Native American students, or to even start new schools. And so we have really had a great partnership with NISN, NACA Inspired Schools Network. And so these are just a few examples. There's also the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. And I would really like to encourage you all to take a look at what sort of organizations are within your region, within your city, and then also nationally to determine ways in which you can engage. Oh, and there's one more that everyone should know about. There's also the Native Ways Federation with Carly, and supporting philanthropic organizations to invest wisely into Native communities. All right, moving on to the next slide. All right, so a call to action. So I just want to spend, in the short amount of time that we have available, I want to share a little bit about what the Bush Foundation has been doing with our investments in Native American education and how we established that strategy. I think that it's really important to understand that it's a long game. You know, it isn't just a plop some sort of investment, find that one idea to fund. What we've been learning and what we are continuing to learn is that each investment can kind of lead to some momentum and some other ideas. And each opportunity, each organization can also lead to another idea. So it's a long game, and it's about understanding what each of those threads are. And so our work began with what we call the Native Education Advisory Group in 2017. Carly led that work when she was at the foundation. And there she convened a group of about 15 Native education experts in order to understand what was happening within our region and make recommendations for what needs to happen in order to improve outcomes for Native students. And I think that a really important part to understand there is that it wasn't the foundation who was determining what the recommendations needed to be. It was convening a group and supporting a group in order to have those conversations and then make recommendations for us to consider. So what came out of those recommendations were COSA with supporting that accreditation of tribal schools, also work in North Dakota and South Dakota with their Departments of Ed and their Department of Tribal Affairs in order to implement and incorporate Native education standards for not only Native students, but for all students in those states. As well, we convened what we call our Native Nations Learning Journey, where we had about 20 Native educators from around our region who saw best practices within our region and also traveled out to NACA and other schools in the Pueblo Nation, and saw ideas. And from there, that led to even more work. What is happening right now, an alliance. It's building on that momentum and ideas and promise of what we can do for students in our region. It's called the Wakanija Tokeachi, which means Children's First Collective. And so we're looking forward to what sort of recommendations and actions come from out of that work. So, it listed quite a few different things that we're doing, but we're always looking to figure out, what more can we do? And really having Native educators, Native leaders, students drive the direction of our work. Let's see, so we have a little bit more time. Carly, do you want to talk more about your work? I think that would be great to do here.
Yeah, I just put in the chat if others want to share maybe what their commitments are. I'll share what mine is. So I commit to, continuing to tell my story and my family's story, to lifting up the stories and voices of other Native friends, relatives, colleagues who are doing the same. Through my work at Native Ways Federation, I commit to continuing to be a resource for my community and to others as well. So Native Ways Federation is focused on education and advocacy. And I have a bit of experience working in philanthropy and helping people to make connection, both across our Native communities, but also with folks outside of our Native communities and specifically in the field of philanthropy. So if there are, for those of you in our audience today who want to learn more about some of these topics, again, we're going to have some more sessions. GFE is hosting some more sessions, and so they want to know specifically what you want to learn about. And whether it's Native education related or otherwise, please feel free to reach out to Native Ways Federation so we can help provide some resources and make some connections as well. We have 7 amazing founding member organizations who are doing incredible work, and some of them were on the list that was shared, and then we'll make sure folks have access to, such as the American Indian College Fund and American Indian Science and Engineering Society. But we're also connected with many others. So I commit to being that resource. And I also, on a personal note, I commit to continuing to learn my language so that I can share what I learn with my son, who I think you may have heard earlier. Sorry about that. But with my son and with my other young family members. So thank you.
Dr. Peterson, first of all, thank you so much for everything that you've just shared with us. But Teresa, could you tell us a little bit about about your commitments as well?
Sure, I guess I would echo much of what Ichepashi Carly shared in that, I'm committed to continuing to learn my language. I'm a language learner, been doing that for a number of years, and it's a lifelong journey. I do some work with Dakota Wichocha, and actually that is a picture of from our organization. It's Native nonprofit dedicated to language and lifeways, Dakota Language and Lifeways here in Minnesota. And they're actually in a potato dance. So I thought it was really sweet. And I continue to provide, these type of opportunities for people to learn. I'm always willing to share and will continue to do that. But I guess my biggest push is for folks to follow up with that list that you will get of additional resources. This was challenging to cover in a very short time. It's a complicated and complex history that brings us forward to today. But again, I want to just thank everyone for the opportunity to connect with you, and I hope that you enjoyed it. And I'll turn it over to Paul.
Great, thank you so much. Our commitment at GFE is to make sure that learning around Native issues and about the Native American education and communities isn't just a one-time thing. As you all heard, this is an ongoing thing that we're trying to do, a learning series. Carly and Native Ways and the Bush Foundation have been already excellent partners across many of our programs outside of the learning series. And so I just want to really thank them for their leadership. And Teresa, Dr. Peterson, thank you so much for imparting on us your wisdom and your knowledge. Hopefully we will be able to partner again. As our panelists alluded to, we are sending out in the chat right now a SurveyMonkey link, excuse me. In that survey, there is a question about what US funders want to learn more about in this learning series. We want to make sure that the content that we create and plan and deliver to you all is relevant to your work so that we are really investing in these issues and in these communities. If at any point in time you have a question about, maybe you have an idea or you want to see more of something, just feel free to email me. In that link, there's a link to a Google Doc that Dr. Peterson created with additional resources that she was talking about. So make sure to check that out. And with that said, we actually have a conference year-round session next week. It's called Strengthening the Teacher of Color Pipeline in Tribal Communities. So be sure to check that out if you're registered for a conference. And with that said, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to our panelists for all of the work and effort and all of your time. And we will look forward to working together again soon. Thank you, everyone.